Good morning. Hemshech Ayin Beis, Volume 3, page 1439. Aleph Tov Lamed Tes at the top. So in the continuation of understanding Kudsha Brichu and Shechinta, Yichud, Kudsha Bricha and Shechina, the Kodesh Baruch and Shechina, as he said, Ad Reim HaMailas, on the top of page 1436. So far we've covered that it's Kodesh Baruch and Shechina, Zah and Malchus of Atzilus. It's Chochma and Bina of Atzilus. It's Keser and Chochma and Atzilus. And in Keser and Arich of Atzilus, it's Malchus and the Mides of Arich as they relate to Atzilus. And then the Mides Atzmim, the Rotzen Atzmi, that's completely above Chochma and completely above even Chochma Stima, the superconscious intelligence, the concealed wisdom in Arich. Those are the two levels. And that second level explains the Mishnah Chassidim. What does it mean that the Geula comes from the level of Keser that radiates into Avah, that we're not talking about just the regular fact that Abba v'Ima enclose the arms of Arich, but we're talking about the Pnimius Hamidus, the Pnimius of Arich, what he says, that Chinas Midas Atzmis of Keser, that brings the Geula. Okay, then we move to the next level. In Keser itself, now we're moving higher. Arich is Shechina, and Atik is Kudsha Brichu. Arich, which is Nefesh of Atzilus, is Shechina, which is Reish HaNetzolim, it relates to the emanations, and Atik, which is Tachteina Shebamaitzel, which really is like a reflection of an expression of the Maitzel, of the emanator, that is Kudsha Brichu. Kodesh removed, that's removed. And the inyan in this is, so he explained that both names, Atik Yemen and Arich Ampin, are Shemus Nedofim, Murkovim, Shemus Murkovim. They're a composite of two words, Atik Yemen, Arich Ampin, and these two words indicate opposites, because they're both interfaces of two opposites. Atik means Hatoka, removed. Yemen is Gilui. It manifests, a Yemen, Amshachen HaGilui. Arich means Bligvul, long, Bligvul. Ampin is Bechinas Hagbala, a face. Especially when you consider that the face is with the level of Moichin, which is Hagbala, Pnimi. Pnimi is already defined and limited and limited revelation. So Acha Inyan Hu, so we learned what's the Inyan in this is, because both Arich Ampin and Atik Yemen are interfaces. So in Arich Ampin, Nimshach HaArich Ampin, that's what it means. That the Arich, the Bligvul of Arich, of godliness, is manifesting in Ampin, Arichus Haponim, which means that this Arich, Bligvul, comes the Oyer HaShayach Al HaPnimis. We're talking about the Oyer that relates to Pnimius, to the immanence of the structure of existence, but it's in a form of Arich Arichus Ponim. In Zohar Ampin, it's not Arichus. There, what dominates is the structure. In Arich, what dominates is the Ratzon, but it's a Ratzon that's already manifesting in Aponim, Arichus Aponim. And so it's a form of Eine Bechinas Hagbala. Like we learned earlier, that there is already the beginnings of structure, but it's still primarily the effect of Arich and Ampin. In Atik Yemen, how do we explain the two words? So Atik Yemen, Nimshach Tevis Yemen El Atik. When you say Atik Yemen, what's the dominant word here? Is Atik. That Yemen, what kind of Yemen are they? They're Atik Yemen. So he says the word Yemen, Nimshach Tevis, that the Atik Yemen, Nimshach Tevis Yemen El Atik. That the Yemen, which is what? The Gili. So the Gili of Yemen is Netak Mebchinis Yemen. So though it's a level of Gili and Hamshach Yemen, but it's in the state of Atik Yemen. Like even the simple interpretation in the verse in Daniel, which says Atik Yemen Yosef al Kusaya, the one of many years, or Atik, old years, or removed. What are you saying? That it's a sage. Means, yes, he has Yemen, but it's in a state of Atik. There, the interpretation I'm saying is the Atik means aged. Here, Atik means removed. So it's a Yemen that's removed. And now he's going to explain what that means in more detail. That's where we stop. And then we're going to go back and understand how Atik Yemen and Arich Ampen are two forms of interface. One is on the level of Kudsha Brich, one is the level of Shechinta. The Yadua, so I'm continuing on line 5 on page 1439, and the pages can be found at ayinbeis.com. The Yadua, the Atik Yemen, Zeu B'china Zayin Tachtein is the Atik. So Atik, like all levels, have 10 spheres. Yes, we learned earlier that the spheres are there not as structured spheres. They're under the influence, like you said, the Ratzon for Chachma, the Ratzon for Bina. In Atik is the Tainug of Chachma, the Tainug of Bina. But in Atik Yemen, there's the 7 Dayan Tachtenis. That's why it's called Yemen. If you just say the word Atik, or even Primius Atik, then you're talking about Atik that's removed from Yemen. You say Atik Yemen, he says that's specifically the level of Zayin Tachtenis, the 7 lower levels, meaning from Chesed through Malchus of Atik. That's why it's called Yemen. Hu Shegam HaZayin Tachtenis. And that's the meaning of Atik Yemen. That even the Zayin Tachtenis, the 7 lower levels, which are the Yemen, the days of Atik, days referring to like 7 days in the week. So the same thing as the 7 levels. In Atik, the lower levels, that also the 7 lower levels, are in a state of Havtok and Avdallah. This line could have been read yesterday, right, and following before. It's not like a new subject. I just stopped at some point. So think of it, this is explaining what means Atik Yemen. Okay. Then he continues. Remember, Me'er is like that Kabbalistic encyclopedia, Me'er Papirash, where in Erech Ayin, which is Atik, Mareches Ayin, in the letter Ayin, in the Sefer Me'er on letter Ois Nun Hey, section 55, he says like this: Atik Nikra Vov Tachtenis. The Atik is called the 6 lower levels, not the 7, 6. But Arich Ampin Hamal B'Shei say Nikra Gamken Al Shem Shmoi Atik Yemen Atkan L'Shene. Now, why he says 6 and not 7, I have to look up. Not sure. Unless I don't think it's a mistake. I think it is 6. But he adds another key thing, that Arich Ampin, which is the lower level in Keser, Hamal B'Shei say. Arich Ampin, like we learned before, every garment, the lower level is a garment to a higher level. So Arich Ampin is a garment that encloses Atik. Nikra Ganken Al Shem Shmoi Shmoi Atik Yemen. That Arich is also called by the name Atik Yemen because it's like a garment to Atik. So in addition to Atik Yemen being the level of Atik itself, Arich Ampin is also called by that name because Arich Ampin is like a garment for Atik Yemen. Why is he saying this? We'll soon see. But it's clearly the plot thickens here because till now we've been talking Atik and Arich as separate entities. But now, according to the Me'er, Arich has an element of where it's called Atik Yemen. Let's see where he's going with this, and then we'll understand it better. Ba'ayim Ashen is boil il. Atkan l'shene. That's the language in the Me'er. Ba'ayim Ashen is boil il. And delve into, let's look deeper into what we discussed earlier. Where? Dibra Maskal El Maseh. As they cite below the footnote, the publisher writes that it could be that though it does say that in the manuscript of the Rebbe Rashab, but maybe he means Bereshis Bara Tafresh Ayin Hey, which is in volume 2. So I have to look it up. I mean, I'm relying that they looked it up, and this topic is spoken about in Brich, but the Rebbe Rashab does write Maseh. So we have to know why. Maybe there's something there, maybe not. But regardless, I'll look it up to see what it says there. But he discusses there, sometimes it's very obvious that there's something, it's not there. Because like here, there's a topic. What does he discuss back there? Be'inyan me'eh shana. So we know the topic is chayesara. So it says, V'hiyu shnei chayesara me'eh shana, esim shana v'sheva shanim. So it explains the level of me'eh shana. What's me'eh shana? I think actually there, I'm not sure if he's talking about chayesara. I may be wrong about that. I'll look it up. But anyway, it talks about me'eh shana. Me'eh shana is 100 years. What does he say? The Atik, the Ayidei Slapshus Atik Ba'arich. by the manifestation and the enclothing of Atik within Arich, who the idea slapshus Atik barach who ba'arich ampim shana loshen yochid mepnei the antu chad. Okay, why does it say meir shana? Why does it say meir shanim? 100 years. 100 year doesn't seem to apply. You say year on 1 year. It's 100 should be plural. So what's the reason it says shana? So he explains because it's referring to Atik being mislabish in Arich. So therefore, in Arich Ampin, it's become shana because what's radiating Loshen Yochid mepei the Antu Chad. Atik is the level where that radiates the unity of the divine. Antu Chad, you are one. And since that Chad of Atik is radiating in Arich, so Arich Ampin is called Meya Shana, Shana Loshen Yochid, even though it's Meya, even though there's 100. Similar to what he said before about Atik Yemen, even though it's Yemen, but it's in a state of Atik. So even though it's Meya, but it's in a state of Shana Achdus.
Do you see that Arich is called Atik?
Excuse me?
Where do you see that Arich is called Atik?
It says that. So he's the source. He probably has, there's probably, if you look it up, there's probably sources there. If you look at the Yoyer Nesiv there's a commentary on the Me'er where he brings the sources. Clearly in Kabbalah, sometimes Arich is called Hashem Atik Yemen. I mean, you can find it. In Chassidus, there's a number of times where Arich and Atik are considered like one level. But here he doesn't really go into detail. He just states that. Okay, so now I understand what he's saying here. So now he explained like this. Atik is Kudsha Brichu. Kodesh umuvdal hatoka. Arich is Shechinta. We want the Yichud of Atik and Arich. We want the Yichud of Kudsha Brich and Shechinta, the Yichud of Atik and Arich. Now, within that itself, they both are interfaces. Atik takes from the Hatoka V'Avdallah of HaKadosh Baruch Hu and Mizmamshech into Yemen, into Gili. Arich Ampin takes the Bligvul and is mamshechin into ponim, anpin. So they both are interfaces. Then there's the interface between Atik and Arich. Being there two parts of Kesed, they interact. That's why he brings, I believe, the Ma'er, because the Ma'er is saying that you see that Arich and Atik have something in common. So in addition to the fact that the lower levels of Atik are permeated with the Yemen, the 7 lower levels are permeated with Atik. Atik also is Nimshach in Arich, and that's why Arich is called Atik sometimes. And why does he bring from earlier about Meir Shana? Because Meir Shana is the Yichud of Kudsha Brich and Shechinta of Atik and Arich. That's why in Arich you have the Achdus, the Kudsha Brich Kulachat, the Kudsha Brich of Shechinta, Liyachid Kudsha Brich of Shechinta, that there's a union. The Chad, the Achdus of Kudsha Brich of Atik radiates within Arich, and that's why it's called Meir Shana, Loshen Yachid. So what you have here is Kudsha Brich Shechinta as Atik and Arich. And that concludes this level. Now he's going to move even higher up. But I'll stop here if anybody wants to ask anything.
Is the Me'er Nosen Shapiro?
Meir Papirash. Nosen Shapiro wrote a pirush on Me'eres Nosen. He writes a pirush on the Me'er. I'm almost sure it's Meir Papirish. I mean, we can look it up. And maybe, now that you bring it up, maybe let's look it up. We can look it up. Are there any questions?
I think that's right. I'm trying to find it myself right now. Yes, I'm trying to find it online.
Well, it'd probably be Hebrew books, if anything.
Yeah, it's not there, but
I have Meir Papyrus, I'm almost sure is the name of or Meir Papyrus.
you're right. It's papyrus.
Yeah, that I know, but there's a commentary there that brings all the sources. I could look it up. I have the Sefer. Yeah. Okay. Are there any questions before we continue?
Yeah, I did have that line, one line, the fourth line down. No, I guess I was done yesterday, where it says Atik Yomin Nimshach, the line above, third line. But Atik Yomin Nimshach Yomim El Atik Diano Netak Bebichidis Yomim. Yomim is going. Atik is going into Yomim, no? Didn't we say Atik or Abdallah into Yomim? How's Yomim going into Atik there? Atik Yomim Nishachtiya.
When you say the word Nimshach Tevis Yamin El Atik means that when you have the word Atik Yamin, that the word Yamin is basically being drawn toward Atik. Because in other words, Atik is describing what kind of Yamin. That's all it means, which means that the Yamin are, even though they're a level of Hamshach and Gilu Yaim, nevertheless, they have an element that's removed from the regular structure of Yaim.
Okay.
It's like bringing something from higher than time into time.
Right, and that's why I would have thought it would have said Atik Nimshach B'Yomim Yomim. The higher levels is Nimshach into Yomim.
Read Atik Yamin. Yamin Nimshach. So it says Atik Yamin Nimshach Tevis Yamin and Atik. The word, it's simply the way Hebrew is written. That Yamin is referring. What kind of days? Atik Yamin. Okay. So now he's going to move to the next level. Kudsha Brich Shechinta, higher than Atik and Arich. So we have so far Zal Malchus, Chachma and Bina, Keser and Chachma, in Keser and Arich. Now it's Atik and Arich. Now we're going higher, next level. So he says like this. Well, the Mailam is there, and higher than this, we also have Kudsha Brich and Shechinta, where the level of Bechinas Malchus the Ak. So now the world that's higher than Atik and Arich, which is Keser, we know higher than that is Nekudim, and higher than that is Akudim, all the way to Ak. So Malchus of Ak, we've learned how Malchus of Atzilus is Shechinta. We learned how Malchus of Arich and Keser is Shechinta. So now he's saying even higher is Malchus of Adam Kadmon. Gam ken nikra Shechinta. That's also called Shechinta. So as we discussed, you have Kudsha Brich and Shechinta throughout Ad Reima Mailis, throughout all of Ishtalshlus and higher. And we've been climbing since the top of page 1436, level by level, which very much corresponds to the discussion earlier in Hamayrik Be'echad, where we also climbed from Dibur to Machshava to Keiches to Keser to Ak to before the Tzimtzum. So it's very much part of the contemplation of Yichud, Kudsha Brich Shechinta. Like I explained, Hamayrik Be'echad, we're unifying the divine as it comes down into existence all the way upwards to the highest levels. It's essentially what the Rebbe Rashab is doing here. And it's all part of Krishma. Like we said, Krishma, Shema, Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, because this whole topic began, these are the 288 letters in Shema, the bottom of page 1435. We'll get back to that, which of course is preceded by Yetzer, the Birchus Yetzer of the Malachim that help and support the processing of this Achdus into existence. So now we're moving to Malchus of Adam Kadmon.
248, I think, not 88.
Ramah, I said 248, correct. Yeah. So Malchus of Ak, Nikra Gam Ken Nikra Shechinta. So now we're going to explain that. So let's relearn. Va'inyan hu. Here too, I'd probably make a new paragraph. Ulamaila mizeh b'chinas Malchus dak to make it just easier to see the flow. Va'inyan hu. What's the inyan in the Malchus of Ak? Like he says in Yisrei, Daf Samach Zayin Amud Aleph 67a. In the footnote, the publisher writes, maybe it should say 57b, 67b. I'm assuming because they looked inside and the topic is on 67b, but I will look it up as well. I always like to double check. So what does he say there in Zayar? Is melech le'ela v'raza de kodesh hakadoshim. That there's this supernal king, a melech le'ela. There's a king, a level of melech above the raza, and that is manifest in the secret. You know the word seid, when you say seid at simtsum, but raza is an expression used often in Zohar and Kabbalah. We say the secret. It means like the doctrine of, but raza in the secret of kodesh kadoshim. So secret is not really the exact translation. It means more than just secret. It means in the. I've always struggled to find the right word in English. You say beraza, the Kodesh HaKadoshim, you're like almost saying in the level of. But in Kabbalah and Pnimis HaTeirah, raza refers to a secret, but it's referring to beraza like it's the mystery of Kodesh HaKadoshim maybe. That's what the Zohar says. So it's quite cryptic. What does that mean? So he's now going to explain what that means. It says like this. The Ramaz explains, the Ramaz is Moshe Zakuto, is another classic commentary on Zohar from the students of the Arizal. Shazel b'chinas Malchus da'ak. That the Zohar, when it says Melech le'ela, the Raza, the Kodesh HaKadoshim, is not referring to Malchus of Atzilus, not referring to Malchus of Keser, it's referring to Malchus of Adam Kadmon, the first of all the worlds, so to speak, the first of all the dimensions created after the from the Kav, after the Tzimtzum. Why then is it called Malchus? The Nikra Malchus, or Nikra Melech rather. Why is it called Melech? Mipnei shemekabelas mepchinas ein sof. This is all the Ramaz. Called Melech because this level of Malchus of Ak is receiving from Ein Sof, from the infinite. Hainu, this means B'chinas Ak shenikra Ein Sof. That's receiving what is Ein Sof here? Ak. Malchus of Ak, which is the lowest level in Ak, is receiving from Ein Sof. What's Ein Sof? Adam Kadmon. Again, it's all relative because Ak, compared to lower worlds, is called Ein Sof. We already said this earlier regarding Zah. We said Zah compared to Bria is Ein Sof. We said Keser compared to the spheres is Ein Sof. Now we're talking about Ein Sof of Ak compared to lower levels. So it's Malchus because it's Mekabeles. It received from Ein Sof, which is Ak. Shenikra Ein Sof commission is bar le'il. As was explained earlier, definitely in volume 1, probably more than just volume 1, volume 2, even here in volume 3. I'd have to look up exactly where was the last time he mentioned it, but Ak is called Ein Sof. I'll explain that in a moment. Umashpas bin Netzolim. So Malchus receives from Ein Sof and in turn transmits bin Netzolim to the emanations that come lower into Atzilus. U'kamoshon is bar le'il, as was also explained earlier, dibra mastel kisavoyu v'shafsa. In the Maimer Kisavoyu, in the bottom they quote, they say, volume 2, page 979. Okay. Now,
So our 67B is correct.
Definitely, it's worthwhile looking up these places, and I will do so. Because as I said, this section's in Ayin Beis is very brief and dense, but he's definitely connecting these ideas to things that were themes that were elaborated much more at length earlier in Ayin Beis. And that's why he's referring to so far to my modem I see in the last few lines. Me'eshana, Now this one, so basically the Malchus of Ak now is another level in this whole picture that is interfacing between Ein Sof of Ak and Mashpes L'Natzolim, like he explains in that Maimer. Okay. That is Shechina. What is Kudsha Brichu in Ak? Va'atzmius Ak, and the very core of Adam Kadmon, Hu B'chinas Kudsha Brichu. That's the level of Kudsha Brichu. So here you have an Ak, both levels. Va'ayim Asher Kosev. I'm going to explain. Let me just read a little more. And va'ayim Asher Kosev b'his sofis b'teir er ba'abir the va'anina sati. So again, something that needs to be looked up. To look in Teira Er in the back, there are Haisofis additions. So it says to look in that Maimer in the explanation of Anina Sati. My assumption is that he's talking there about these levels, the level of Atzmius Ak, and maybe also the lower levels of Ak.
Is Rabbi Saul Sarugata in the...
One minute.
Oh,
1 minute. I'm going to stop for questions shortly. Let me explain this to explain that what we're talking about, and we'll soon answer questions if you don't mind. Please be patient. So, the first obvious question that I'm sure some of you may be wondering is this just a play of words? Where, I mean, what's the difference between Malchus of Ak and Malchus of Keser and Malchus of Atzilus? From our perspective, all of them are deep and high, sublime spiritual worlds. But as I explained yesterday, especially Ayin Beis, which is the most profound and most comprehensive Hemshech and Chassidus in general, Primis HaTeira, these are not just words. These are the map, the whole map of Seder Shtalshlus. And we really understand the difference between Ak and Keser and Atzilus. They're actually three very, very different levels. I know for most of us, like I always point out, for most of us, just being able to subdue and keep your Yetzer Hara at bay and connect a little to maybe Malchus of Asiya is already a big achievement. To be able to say Shema, even with very basic Pirush HaMilah, simple interpretation, is also an accomplishment. But the Rebbe Rashab, in his benevolence, is giving us the map of the whole picture. And as I've pointed out many times, each of us can find these levels within ourselves, relative to us, and they are very different. He's not elaborating what is the difference between Ak and Atik and Arich, Keser, and Atzilus here, because firstly, he discussed it earlier, and he's relying that we know the difference. What he's doing here is just telling us the Kudsha Brich Shechina dimension in each of these levels. But to truly appreciate it, you really have to understand how is Elokus and Mitzias, existence and godliness, manifest in Ak, how does it manifest in Keser, and how does it manifest in Atzilus? So just briefly, to make it a little more relatable and accessible, we go back to Mipsari Echzalaka, from my flesh I behold God. We have to find an example in our own lives of these levels to make it make any sense. So the classic example is the one that he's been giving earlier of our own faculties. The nefesh of a person, as it manifests in a body, your soul inside your body, is essentially a mirror image of the whole Seder Shtalshlus, of all these levels that we're talking about here. It's a mirror image. And like we say, Elam Katan Zeh Adam. The human being is a universe, a microcosm. It's a Elam Nasim Belibam. So the truth is, when we say, for example, in the morning, Neshama Shenesata Bi Tahirihi, Ata Barasa, Ata Yitzarta, Ata Nefachta Bi, you're saying these levels. Generally, in Tahirihi is Atzilus, Barasa, Bria, Yitzir, Asiya. But in Elam is the Klolos, in the macrocosm, it's also Atzilus the Klolos is before the Tzimtzum. Ak is Bria, Ata Barasa. Ata Nefachta is Keser. And Ata Yotzarta is Keser. And Ata Nefachta Bi is Atzilus and Biyah the Protis, in microcosm. So we have all these levels within us. How do we explain that? So on a very basic level, that's why I often give the example of the developing fetus as a child develops into a full-blown child. That it begins in a seed, it begins in a cell that ultimately splits and develops into a full-bodied human being. The same thing with our faculties. The faculties that we're aware of are only the outer level. It's asiya. The power to hear, the power to see. But if you go backwards, you go upwards, you'll find koyach hariyah is also inside your nefesh. Like we spoke about this, koyches nalomim, the concealed faculties. There's the koyches hiyulim, the potential faculties. There's the koyches atzmim, the core faculties. Haklulim benefesh, as they're encompassed in the nefesh. And there's the nefesh that's neisha koyches, that encompasses and includes the power to give out these faculties. Why are they so relevant? So psychologically, it's very understandable. Our consciousness is shaped by our superconsciousness. So Atzilus would be our consciousness. But Atzilus is the perfect state of consciousness. Bri, Yitzir, and Asiya, the protis, the microcosm, is already consciousness as it's becoming part of our reality. But it's still consciousness, Atzilus. Keser is super consciousness. Ak, which is even higher than Akudim, is like you could say how it is all in the kernel of the seed or in the one cell before it's yet developed in any possible way. So understanding this in the human experience, we're really understanding how existence is only the tip of the iceberg, and beneath it lie layers and layers. And these are the layers that we're learning about. And in each layer, you have the two dimensions of Kudsha, Brich, and Shechinta. Zohar and Malchus, Chachma and Bina, Keser and Chachma. In Arich itself, the two levels, Atik and Arich, and now in Ak. So for a person who's really davening and doing the Avodah on all these levels, each Yichud is a very different type of Yichud. The Yichud in the superconscious level is different than the Yichud on the conscious level. The Yichud on the Ak level is very different than on the lower level, but they all have something in common, that you're connecting a higher dimension of the divine to a lower dimension. So really what this comes down to is how well we have mastered the abstractions of Elikus and divine. For someone who's just a beginner, for them it's enough. It's like climbing a mountain. The fact that they got up 10 feet on the mountain is already better than when looking at existence from the ground level or from a valley. But as you climb higher, you experience higher levels of Elikus. So in Ak, it's far, far higher level of Elikus than it is in Keser, which is far higher than it is in Atzilus. Now that still needs to be explained. What are these levels? But basically we have to find within ourselves, if you think about yourself, let's say a year ago, how did you grow in your understanding of godliness, of Elikus? That would be an example. What you knew last year could be the Atzilus within you. What you learned this year could be the Keser. What next year could be Ak. In other words, these levels are essentially symbolizing higher states of divine consciousness, or for that matter, superconsciousness. So really, that's the way you have to understand this to really make sense, because the Rebbe Rashab is giving us the mechanics of it, the details, which level is which, but he's not explaining what is really Ak and Avodah, and what is Keser, what is Atzilus. I just felt the need to just elaborate a bit on that. Obviously, there's a lot more to say, because this has to be applied on a personal level, but I just wanted to say this I think is at least can get the wheels turning inside you to try to apply, how does that work in my life? And again, everybody has it relative to who they are. Okay. Well, he's going to say more about Ak But let me stop here if anybody wants to ask anything.
Yes, first
Is
of all,
the Talmud of Rabbi Yisrael Sarug?
I'm sorry?
Is the Ramaz a Talmud of Rabbi Yisrael Sarug?
No. The Maz is a Talmud of the Talmidei Haracha Rab Chaim Vital. Yisrael Sarug's Talmidim are primarily Emmanuel Chai Reiki, Mishnas Chesidim, Bacharach, Emek HaMelech, Shever Yosef, that's Yosef, yeah. There's a few more. Rameh Mepano.
They are all Rabbi Yisrael Sarug?
They were all makabel from him one way or another, or from his students. You have to look it up online. They'll tell you who this Talmidim. It's much less Talmidim Yisrael Sarug than obviously from the Rachav's Sion.
So the Ramaz from Reb Chaim Vital.
Yeah. Talmidei, good, what's called Gudei Harizal. Gudei Harizal.
So but is it a direct Talmud from Reb Chaim Vital?
I have to look it up. I think he's a Talmud of a Talmud. There's the Semach and Amer Papirash. The people who organized the Kisvei Arizal were colleagues of Rab Shmuel Vital, who was a son of Rab Chaim Vital. I mean, look it up. It's online. You can find it pretty clearly. Okay.
I was going to say that I think this might be the most comprehensive discussion of what you've always said, the interface that we've had. That you say Ayin Beis is all about the interfaces, going all the way from the lowest level. Well, we started with Atzilus, right? This is all into Malchus of Atzilus. Right? He didn't go below that into this whole interface of Kudsha, Brich, Shechinta. Starts in Atzilus and going higher.
Yeah.
But my question to you is, why did it seems like he skipped the worlds of Akudim and Nakudim? Why did we go from Kesser right to Ak rather than no discussion of Akudim and Nakudim? Are they not considered worthy, like stops on the chain of Ishtalshalos, so to speak?
Well, Nakudim is very obvious why, because it's Toyu. In Toyu, Yichud does not work well there. There's a Shviras HaKelim, there's an imbalance. So Nakudim would not be a place where you'd have Yichud, Kudsha, Brich, Shechinta, really. And Akudim, sometimes Akudim and Ak are coupled together, and sometimes Akudim and Kesser are coupled together. We learned before that Torah says everything higher than Silas is concluded in Kesser. It's common that he goes these levels, that from Kesser will go to Ak. And as I said, either it's included there, or he feels we can extrapolate and figure it out on our own. I will say this, one more point I wanted to mention before that I think is very valuable. Whenever you make a business plan and then something goes wrong, you always go back to your original plans, right? You go back to original drawings. Same thing, let's say, when a contractor is building something and you want to really check, you go back to the blueprint that the architect drew up. And there in microcosm, you'll see something, you'll say, oh, we missed this. So in many ways, Ak is the blueprint of existence. So whatever Kudsha, Brich, Shechinta is playing itself out in Atzilus or Keser and other levels, Ak is ultimately where every little nuance is documented in Machshava Geduma de Ak, in that blueprint, in that snapshot, or in the bird's eye view, if you wish, of all of existence. So it's another way of understanding that when you really want to create the proper unity, you want to be able to not just see it play out in the actual structure of existence, but also in the blueprint, Yichud, Kudsha, Brich, Shechinta. Which is why so often, like for example, God forbid, if somebody needs surgery or something, and they go into the inner workings of the human being, or like a program that needs to be fixed on a computer, the programmer has to go into the very programming language and tinker with it. So in a way, Ak is going into the deepest programming language to understand the Yichud, Kudsha, Brich, Shechinta on that level. I just wanted to add that to visualize somewhat what we're talking about here.
As a follow-up to your comment about why Tohu wouldn't be referenced in this chain of Yichudim of Shechinta with Kudsha Brich, I mean, that seems like a pretty important point. I mean, it makes sense what you said, that it's, a level of chaos. So it would be it's hard to talk about a Yichud in that context. Nevertheless, because that is at such a high level, and that seems like a pretty fundamental disconnect. I mean, the whole point of this past 3, 4, 5 pages has been to show that the Yichudim are continuous and contiguous, that there is a one chain. And if you have a disjunction, even at that one of the highest levels, then you can have Yichudim below that, but you can't how do you reconnect with the top, which is, the source?
Very simple, because Tayu is the tikkun of Tayu is Atzilus. And Tayu is a process, what's called Seisar Amnas Livnes. The shattering of the imbalance of Tayu, his intention is to be repaired and to create the Yichud in tikkun. So in Tayu, there's a lack of iskalulus, a lack of interconnectivity, or another way of saying a lack of Yichud, proper balance. And Tayu is actually the correction of that. It's the repair. That's why it's called tikkun. Exactly correct. So the Yichud, Kudsha, Brich, Shechinta is the Yichud that corrects the lack of Yichud in Tayu.
Thank you. Very clear.
So basically, that Shviras Kalim and Tohu and Nakudim is intentional, obviously.
Absolutely.
So far we've been discussing about this Hishtalshalis, that's an unbroken chain all the way from Atik down to Malchus of Atzilus, and all these different levels. And in one stop, so to speak, one link in that chain, there was an intentional break by God.
I discussed it many times. I call it a market correction. Tayu is not an accident. Tayu is part of the process. It's just like, for example, when a child comes out of the mother's womb, it has to shed many cells because the head is too large. And so the shedding and so-called is really not meant, and the pain involved is not meant to be an end in itself. It's meant to prepare the ground as a paradigm shift takes place.
So in order for a paradox shift, you need a pain, a disconnect?
Well, once there's a tzimtzum, and the tzimtzum conceal the divine unity, yes, Tayu is a good example of essentially a market correction, saying we need to figure out how to reconcile and compensate for we'll call it the cosmic dissonance between Eris and Kalim.
Right. The analogy of a market correction, though, I would question a little, because market correction is something that's done unintentionally. There's something changed in the market that wasn't a plan, and we have to correct to it.
Okay, here, so I'm just using the expression. Okay, so in this case, it's a deliberate.
Right.
It's like, I think of market correction here like the immune system. That when a person has a certain dissonance or shakeup in their system, they need a Shviras HaKelim to wake them up to realign themselves. That's what I really mean. It's like an immunity, part of the immunity system.
But you would think that if that Shviras HaKelim, that Tika, that the Tohu would be then in Kesser, because Kesser's right before Olam Atiku and Atzilus, rather than two chain links above, it goes up to Kesser and then to Akudim, and then Nakudim. So you would think that the break, so to speak, the disconnect, as Yitzhak mentioned, that nice term, the disconnect there, you would have thought that it would have been right before Atzilus, which would have been in Kesser. Why was it done 2 links before, so to speak, in Olam Nakudim rather than in Kesser?
As you could imagine, I'm going to say is that this is not context of Ayin Beis now, right? Let's just state that for I'll answer your question.
Okay.
It's a short.
You're right.
It's a short answer, but here's a perfect example where you've gone off something that's interesting, but has nothing to do with this Ayin Beis. Just want to make that clear. At the end of the day, I have to be the umpire and the referee of the game that we're playing here. So the answer to your question, since you asked it already, I'll tell you, is Keser is part of the process of Atzilus. It's called Keser of Atzilus. Where would Toyu fit in between Keser and Chochmah? Keser and Atzilus, the Toyu has its own world and also has a Keser. So Keser is part of the Atzilus process. So you have Ak, Keser of Ak. Then you have Akudim, which includes Keser and its 10 spheres. Then you have Nukudim, Keser and its spheres. Then you have Atzilus and its Keser and its spheres. Understand?
Thanks.
Let's see here. Do we continue on?
If you don't continue, I have a quick question, but if you do, I'll just hold it back until after the recording.
Just a moment. I'm just looking whether I think that the rest is. Well, so far what we learned, let me sum it up and then I'll just say what we're going to learn afterwards and we'll learn it tomorrow. Basically, so now he's moved to Ak and explained that Shechinta in Ak is Malchus of Ak, that channels Ein Sof of Ak. And Atzmius Ak is Kudsha Brichu, the core of Ak. But he's going to dissect this further, just like he did with Keser. First, he spoke the two levels in Arich. Then he moved Atik and Arich. In Ak as well, he's also going to explain. So I'll just read a few more lines. And according to what it says in Mishnah's Chassidim, he quotes again Mishnah's Chassidim here. Masechta Klolos Ha'elemus Reish Perek Beis. In the Masechta called Klolos Ha'elemus is the beginning of chapter 2. What does he say there? The Ak b'chinas Arich the Klolos Ha'elemus. Ak is like the Arich. Just like Keser has an Arich of Atzilus, Keser of Atzilus, I should say. So the Arich of Klolos Ha'elemus on a macrocosmic level is Ak. Ak is like the Keser Kloli or the Arich Kloli of Klolos Ha'elemus. So based on that, Yesh Leimer, like we learned earlier, that Arich is Shechinta compared to Atik. Yesh Leimer, the Klol is B'chinas Ak or B'chinas Shechinta. So based on that, the general Ak, not just Malchus of Ak, general Ak, just like he said before, he broke it down, it was Malchus of Arich, was Shechinta, and Zoh, or Midas Atzmim of Arich was Kudsha Brichu. Same thing now with Ak. First he said it's Malchus of Ak is Shechinta, and Atzmius Ak is Kudsha Brichu. But based on the Mishnah Chassidim, Klolos, all of Ak is like Arich, so all of it is the B'chinas Shechinta. Klolos B'chinas Ak and B'chinas Shechinta. K'moshe Arich B'chinas Nefesh Kanal. Just like we learned before that Arich is the Nefesh of Atzilus. So you could extrapolate from that Ak, which is the Arich of all Shtalshus, all close elements, is the level of Shechinta. V'hainu, what does that mean? B'chinas Chitzenius Ak. That's referring to the outer dimension of Ak, like the outer dimension of Keser. So b'chinas Machshava Hagduma, that's the primordial thought. The Klolos Shtalshus, where God is envisioning Klolos Shtalshus, v'shoshim u'mekedam, and their root and their source. But then what's Kudsha Brichu? Kudsha Brichu b'chinas Pnimius Ak. That's Pnimius Ak. And how do we understand that? So he's going to quote something we learned earlier. Like we explained elsewhere, and it's explained at length earlier in Ayin Beis. He's going to quote in a moment. That what? When you say Kudsha Brichu is takel baraisa, Kudsha Brichu looked into the Torah. What does that mean? He says that Torah b'chinas chitzenius Ak. Torah is the blueprint. That's the outer dimension of Ak. Like what he called now Shechinta. I am Mashin Bar Le'il Dibra Maschel Veschanim Ubedrushim Sha'achreza. Look earlier in the Maimer of Veschanon, and in the following discourses, this goes back to volume 1, page 343 and on, as they cite. And what is Kudsha Brichu? Who looks into the Torah, Hu b'chinas hakav hamislabish ba'ak. That's the kav, the ray of light that follows the tzimtzum that manifests in ak. Shezeh b'chinas pnimius ak. That's pnimius ak. So now he's moved it even higher. First he said Malchus of ak is Shechina, and Atzmis of ak is Kudsha Brich. Now he says all of ak, the outer dimension is Shechina, Torah, and Kudsha Brich is pnimius ak, the kav that manifests within ak. I might as well read till the end of the paragraph. Gam yesh lemer. We can also say Shezeh b'chinas Atik da ak. You could say Kudsha Brich is also the level of Atik of ak. Like he said before, Kudsha Brich is Atik of Atzilus, or Atik of Keser of Atzilus. This is Eitz Chaim that he repeatedly cites many, many times in Ayin Beis and Chassidus. What does he say? Sheyesh kedugmas Atik. Just like there's an Atik in Keser above Atzilus, there's a similar dimension called kedugmas Atik. Le'ela megulgalta delay. Above the skull of Ak. So just like there's a keser, a crown on top of the head of Atzilus, and Atik is there, the higher, the premise of it, so too there's something similar above the crown or the skull of Ak. So based on that, that would be Kudsha Brichu in Ak. V'hu b'chinas reishis hakav. This is the top, the beginning of the kav that begins to flow right after the tzimtzum shanasa b'chinas atik la'ak. Its first manifestation is becomes atik of Adam Kadmon. Ayam asher kosav b'lekut teira ba'abir demeitzeim. Look at lekut teira. This is in Maseh, in the explanation of the mimer called Meitzeim, v'zeu b'chinas Kudsha Brichu. And that's the level of Kudsha Brichu, with Shechina being Chitzeni Yisak, or what he called like Torah, Kudsha Brichu is Takel Baraisa. So now in Ak as well, he's established Kudsha Brichu Shechina two ways. Just similar to what he did before in the levels of Keser. And with that, he concludes the paragraph. Okay. And here's where we shall stop. Are there any questions?
Yeah, I had a question. You before we got to this part of dissecting Ak and even the Kudsha Brichu of Ak, which is this level, whatever that hovers above the skull, beginning of the Kav. Okay, you talked about Ak itself, an idea of each of us trying to relate to these levels of Elokus within ourselves, and within ourselves. You used a muscle, and I know it's just a muscle, but you said it's like, let's say the first cell of ourselves. Like when we first, let's say when parents, the unification of the parents, then you have the cell, the first cell that from which all the other cells of the body split. You suggested that's like, because it contains all of the DNA that will create the human being and everything. So it's a good muscle, but it's kind of hard for a human, for me to relate to that one cell. Like, how can what do I see? What do I draw? What information do I glean from that notion that I can understand myself better? I guess this is a supply question. Maybe you can't do it for a level as high as Ak, but I'm wondering if you can do that. If you can, and I know it's different for each person, but still, this idea of relating to my first cell, like my everything I'm all about.
On psychological terms, it's pretty simple, frankly, but it comes down to simply this: you can treat the symptoms of somebody's, let's say, rage or insecurities or fears, or you can treat the root of it. When you have to repair something on a symptomatic level, a Band-Aid may be enough, or a painkiller. When you have to treat something on a root level, you have to go back into the seed, like sometimes go back to their childhood traumas or childhood experiences. So it all comes down to how far back you go. So the more you understand, it's like nipping something in the bud or waiting till it becomes a problem. So like sometimes there's like we talk about stem cell, for example. That's very different than just dealing with the cell itself. The same thing with anything. When you're dealing with deeper issues, you sometimes have to go back as much as you can to the root level. So the same thing as Seder Shtalshlos. If you're going all the way on the outer level, it's Asiya. You go a little deeper, it's Yitzira. Deeper, Bria, Atzilus, Keser, Ak. And Ak would be going into almost like literally the actual wiring. Another example would be, think of a computer. When you use a phone or a computer, you have the outer interface, which is simply the buttons you press, or the keyboard, or the touch tone, or the touch pad, and you generate things. But if sometimes there's a problem, you have to go all the way back to the language, the computer language. Sometimes you have to actually go back to the machine language of the zeros and ones. So you can find many examples, both in technology and healing and psychology, where it depends how deep you go to get to where you want to get, where you want to really repair something, either the root, like let's say there's a machlekes going on, a fight in a community. So you can try to remedy it on a very basic level, but you can sometimes get back, where did it start from? Or a fight or a shalom bias issue. And then you discover it all started with two people who had a disagreement, and you try to go back to the root and try to repair it from the root place, and then automatically it'll be much better, you can improve it, rather than just preparing it on the outer level. So that's all, these are examples of how you go deeper and deeper all the way back to the core.
Very helpful. Thank you. That was beautiful. Kudsha supplied. Thank you.
When we say that Hakod, or when Torah says that Hakudsha Brichu, or was it Hakudsha Baruchu Histalka Baraisa Bara Alma? Is that the when we refer to it generally as the Torah as the blueprint of creation? Is God looking at the level of Ak, so to speak, into it, or is it in Atzilus where Moshe received it? Or
no, that's exactly what he says. No, Chitzenius Ak is the Torah that he's looking. That's the blueprint. Chitzenius of Adam Kadmon. That's the explanation in that Zohar.
Wow. So that's when somebody says, "What's that mean?" You can say, in Penivus Tikalever, Hashem looking looking into Chitzonius of Ak, or revealing Chitzonius of Ak. What would be the lashon you would use to apply what we just learned to that?
Well, we understand when you say God is looking, we don't mean necessarily how humans look. It means he's engaging with that level.
Engaging. Good.
So this highest level, I'm sorry, I apologize, please.
Go ahead. If you want more on this, besides what he referred to in volume 1, it's also discussed earlier on page 1405.
My other question was, this highest level, the Pneumius of Ak, which is this level of the Kudsha Brichu of Ak, this level of the Kav that's above the skull. So I don't know if he's going to go further than this. It doesn't sound like it, because we're at the end and I looked at the next paragraph. It looks like he goes into a more general summary. But at that, are we at the top? I mean, that beginning of the Kav is essentially the connection to Atzmus. I feel it's the first beginning of God's expression outward.
No, not necessarily. We're going to learn more. Yes.
Oh, okay. All right.
The Kav is after the Tzimtzum. The Kav is after the Tzimtzum. So we're still going to go up to before the Tzimtzum.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So we stop here, end of the paragraph 1430.